Texas, where Representative Moran is standing by for his questions. He is recognized.
Thank you, Dr. Malkus. I want to start with you. One of the comments that my colleague just made, Mr. Bowman, I think I wrote the quote down correctly. He said, if we would have kept schools open, more people would have died from COVID. Does this bear out in the evidence and the statistics that you've looked at across the nation?
It's certainly the case that when people gathered during COVID, there was theoretically a danger of transmission and that COVID led to deaths. This is clearly a concern. When we look back at the evidence, and this is not as of late, it was in October, November 2020, there were claims that actually the evidence appears that schools are not spreading COVID. If you look at the death rates among children, they are just a fraction, like a very small number. And the evidence on whether schools, many of which were open during this time with quarantines in place and measures to mitigate transmission, what have we not seen? We have not seen clear studies, and we would expect to see hundreds of them, that would say actually large swaths of the country reopened and deaths resulted. There are some marginal effects in some places. They do not stand up against the weight of the costs of widespread school closures, and some of the transmission that we saw was because it was not done as well controlled and with reasonable mitigation strategies in place, as we saw elsewhere.
Yeah, I haven't seen a statistical connection between opening up earlier and having higher death rates among either adults or children in those areas. And in fact, when I was a county judge in Smith County during the time of the pandemic, when we talked about how to deal with the pandemic as it came on us in 2020, we allowed our school districts to make decisions on their own as to what was best for their school districts. And Tyler Independent School District was one of the first, if not the first, large school district in the state of Texas to reopen in the fall of 2020 after the main wave of the pandemic. And in fact, that school did not see any increase in and did not have any deaths among children throughout the pandemic. And we did not see statistical increases compared to other counties that decided to make other decisions, or other schools that made other decisions as it related to adult deaths per capita in the state of Texas. And that year, learning based on the state's testing was at its highest level and best level ever for Tyler ISD. A lot of that because they actually returned back to normal school year. For those that were faced with medical difficulties where they were at higher risk, did you see that school districts generally provided exemptions for those kids and allowed them to stay home to make accommodation for those kiddos?
In that first full pandemic year, it was standard procedure and almost universal across the country. When you reopened, there was a remote option available, and oftentimes there were multiple remote programs available.
So it was possible to both accommodate those students that were at higher risk and also to generally accommodate those students that needed to push forward with that learning. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. The decision to go fully remote would force a single decision on every student in a district, and many districts did that well into the spring of 2021.
Would anybody on the panel disagree with me to say that the extended school closures during COVID will likely result in larger learning gaps between economically disadvantaged children and non-economically disadvantaged children? Would anyone disagree with that? Would anyone disagree with, and Ms. Ray, pop up if you disagree with that, would you disagree with the statement that those school closures and the learning gap resulting from it will likely lead to increased poverty in the future? Would anyone disagree with that?
I would say that to describe that as a correlation is incorrect, and that the way the word correlation has been used throughout this hearing has been highly incorrect usage.
Well, I'm asking statistically if there's a correlation then between education and poverty, and I hear you saying there's not, but clearly there is, right?
Correlation means there's no other predominant cause. It means that those two things, poverty and closure, are so closely connected that
No,
there's no
I
other
said
cause.
poverty. I said education and poverty. That was my question. Would you agree that there's a statistically significant correlation between education and poverty?
A lack of education definitely contributes to poverty. Yes, sir.
And a lack of education that leads to poverty also leads to people in high areas of poverty being more likely to be a victim of crime, more likely to commit a crime, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to exhibit worse mental health outcomes. And those are all documented scientific studies. Do you disagree with any of those statements?
I don't disagree with any statement that you have made in that sentence.
Mr. Moran, thank
I
you
yield
very,
back.
very much. Thank you very much. There's a new order lineup, and we're going to go Hayes, Owens, DeSantis.